Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum and good evening to our viewers. Welcome to the Justice of Humanity webinar. I'm Sonia Hashmi and it is my pleasure to be your host today. I will begin by sharing a few verses of Quran from Surah Ar-Rum. Humanity webinar. I'm Sonia Hashmi and it is my I would request all the speakers to please mute your phones, please.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فسبحان الله حين تمسون وحين تصبحون وله الحمد في السماوات والأرض وعشيا وحين تظهرون يخرج الحي من الميت ويخرج الميت من الحي ويحيي الأرض بعد موتها وكذلك تخرجون ومن آياته أن خلقكم من تراب ثم إذا أنتم بشر تنتشرون ومن آياته أن خلق لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا لتسكنوا إليها وجعل بينكم مودة ورحمة إن في ذلك لآيات لقوم يتفكرون ومن آياته خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم إن في ذلك لآيات للعالمين ومن آياته منامكم بالليل والنهار وابتغاؤكم من فضله إن في ذلك لآيات لقوم يسمعون.
So exalted is Allah when you reach the evening and when you reach the morning, and to him his due all praise throughout the heavens and the earth. And exalted is he at night and when you are at noon. He brings the living out of the dead and brings the dead out of the living and brings to life the earth after its lifelessness. And thus will you be brought out. And of his signs is that he created you from dust. Then suddenly you were human beings dispersing throughout the earth. And of his signs is that he created for you from yourselves mates that you may find tranquility in them, and he placed between you affection and mercy. Indeed, in that are signs for people who give thought. And of his signs is the creations of heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and your colors. Indeed, in that are signs for those of knowledge. And of his signs is your sleep by night and day, and your speaking of his bounty, and your seeking of his bounty. Indeed, in that are signs for a people who listen. These Quranic verses tell us that all of mankind was created by God, with languages and races coming into existence by design. Allah declares in the Quran in no uncertain terms that diversity among mankind is no accident. It was created as all things are by design. Islam urges us to explore and embrace our cultural differences so that we can be introduced to new ideas and learn lessons upon which our own culture can build a firmer foundation. In keeping with that vision, this webinar is an effort from us to continue the dialogue so we can eventually determine new strategies to overcome racism within our ranks and in the overall Canadian society. Before I invite today's speaker to share their valuable thoughts, I would like to take a moment to introduce ICNA Sisters Canada. We are a nonprofit organization with a vision to build a community that sets a path towards personal excellence in faith, worship, morality, and shares the basis for moral, social, and economic development of the Canadian society. ICNA sisters are committed to support efforts for civil liberties and socio-economic justice. We also strive to strengthen the bond of humanity by serving all those in need and collaborate with other organizations that are working towards similar goals. Our goal is to empower the oppressed and build stronger communities. Without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker for tonight, Sister Rabia Khader. Sister Rabia is the CEO of Deen Support Services and Executive Director of the Muslim Council of Peel Region, as well as the Acting Chair of Federation of Muslim Women. She was formerly a commissioner for the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Let's welcome Sister Rabia Khader.
Assalamu alaikum. Auzubillahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. Where do we start to talk about racism? Well, Sister Samia has set the context very nicely in reference to Islamic tradition as stated in the Quran, and in particular in the verses of Surah Rum. There are, again, references within prophetic tradition that recognize this diversity. The rich diversity of the first community of Muslims when Islam was established also speaks this truth of diversity and inclusivity. And when we look back and view creation from the time of the creation of humanity, the creation of Adam and Eve, we saw this immediate diversity, the diversity of being male and female. And as humanity evolved into nations and tribes, we saw a tremendous richness of creation in diversity. And that diversity is not just about human beings, but it's about the environment. Sameness is dull and boring. Differences are exciting, are interesting. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator, and he creates perfection in any form, regardless of what skin tone or color we end up being born with. Our skin is something we are born with. The color may change in a baby slightly, but it is something we are born with. And it is skin with flesh and veins and blood and bones created from, is it earth and water primarily? So we're all created with the same elements. We are born going all the way back to our mother Eve. So oftentimes people will say it's the human race. And if we believe in creation, that's exactly what it is. There is a human race with tremendous diversity today on the planet, from coast to coast to coast to coast, with different skin colors, different cultures, different languages, and different abilities. Racism is only one aspect of discrimination, but it is probably the most I feel like saying discriminatory aspect. So it's the strongest category that impacts almost everyone, and has, in fact, in our society, created this notion of a hierarchy of beauty. of preferential treatment, of power and privilege, of global dominance. Racism is in many forms within us, amongst us, and against us. Within us as Muslims, we need to recognize that we have deep-rooted issues with racism, which I'm sure will be elaborated on by the other ladies who will be speaking this evening. But racism is not limited within our community. It's also against us, and against us based on our skin color, based on our identity as Muslim women in the form of Islamophobia today. What do we do when it comes to racism? How do we unlearn it? It's not something that is inherent, but it is something that is taught. And unfortunately, it is taught in many of our cultures, and I will speak to my own, being born in a little village in Pakistan, in Punjab, racism is rampant. We judge beauty by skin tone. Shadeism is a huge issue. And that issue of shadeism is in fact, unfortunately, perpetuated by women. Women and how we view beauty, and in particular, how we view beauty when it comes to involving ourselves in the selection of spouses for our children, and particularly wives for our sons. So we need to recognize the fact that racism is really a tremendous violation of our faith. If we stereotype, judge, discriminate, perpetuate bias, make assumptions, act on those prejudices and assumptions about people based on their skin color, that we are indeed violating fundamental values entrenched in our faith, rooted in the Quran, rooted in the tradition of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We need to recognize that. It is every one of our duty to unlearn the institutional, structural, systemic, psychosocial, political values that we have given to this hierarchy of race. The pedestal that we have put white privilege on. Colonization is not an excuse. Internalization is no longer good enough. We have to unlearn, and we have to ensure that we do not teach children today to base how they engage with others on the appearance of their skin, on the tone, or on the shade, on, you know, shadeism and skin tone, skin color, being a significant aspect of how we define beauty and power in our society. We have to break those barriers. We have to move beyond that physical appearance of skin and recognize that there is this notion of the human race, if we go back to creation of Adam and Eve, and that nothing happens without the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates imperfection in absolute perfection. So who are we to judge and compartmentalize aspects of beauty and privilege and power and base it on something so beyond our individual control. We're all created equal by God. As I always like to say, this is sort of a mantra of Dean Support Services and people with disabilities. We're all created equal by God, the most glorious. And that also goes for race, not just around ability. So there are various forms of discrimination, but racism is probably as powerful as sexism is. So as women, we face discrimination. So that's the 51% of the population. As women, we face discrimination because of the sheer fact that we are women. We didn't choose to be women. This is how we are created. We are created as women. However, 100% of humanity is impacted by racism, and a very small percentage of those of humanity has privilege and doesn't face that form of racism that racialized communities do. It is our duty to ensure today that we recognize what racism is doing to us, every one of us, what it's doing in our institutions, in our organizations, in our neighborhoods, in our families, in fact, and in our society as a whole. And globally, we have to recognize what racism is doing. We have to recognize that every one of us is responsible for perpetuating racism, because we all have biases behind closed doors and engage in microaggressions. Any one of us who says that we don't, we're lying. We have to be honest with ourselves around our behaviors in private spaces, whether it's in the form of humor, whether it's in the form of private conversation. It is harmful and hurtful, and it is perpetuated. We have to return back to the basics of our tradition and recognize the basics of the power of creation. And we have to remember that we will have to answer for our racist behavior. Racism may not be labeled as quote unquote a sin, but it is immoral, unethical behavior. And therefore it is sinful. If we are to truly embrace a universal sisterhood, then we have to embrace our differences. We have to recognize this hierarchy of race, where white is at the top and black is at the bottom, and everything else is in between. And that racism is perpetuated in our basic language, when somehow there's always a negative undertone to describing black in any one of our native languages, whether English or otherwise. And that expression of blackness constantly has negative undertones. And I won't speak too much to that. I will leave it to my sisters on the panel who are Black to speak to their experiences directly. But when we say that we don't see color, we're denying creation. So I caution us against using that cop-out line of, oh, I don't see color, I don't discriminate. If you don't see color, then those of you that know me will hear my joke saying, then you're as blind as me, because I really don't see color. But the fact is, you do see color. I don't want people to see me as colorless, as invisible. There is nothing wrong with my color. There's nothing wrong with any one of us color, whether we are black, brown, white, or any other shade of skin in between. Color is something you see, but it is not something that you judge as negative. It is not something that you add certain values to devalue, to marginalize, to alienate, to attribute characteristics that are not desirable, beautiful, attractive. We really have a big job to do, women, because we do take responsibility for teaching many of the values to our sons and daughters that carry forward in generations. So we have to go back to the basics of our faith, recognize that there's no place for racism in our faith tradition, because in fact, if we are discriminating, if we are racializing, if we are perpetuating racism, then we are indeed in violation of the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we are passing judgment on his creation, and he is the creator and he creates in perfection. Jazakumullah khairan for this opportunity to share my thoughts with you on the various forms of racism and discrimination.
Thank you very much, Sister Rabia, for an interesting talk. Identifying the problem is always the first step towards finding the solution. Our next speaker, Sister Sharon Douglas, has worked in the human services for over 20 years. Sharon has worked in the human service throughout her service. She has held various positions. Currently, she is a consultant to United Way Greater Toronto, June 2019. Sharon has provided leadership and direction at councils, which is a hallmark of positive and meaningful engagement. Sharon's vision of supporting marginalized communities led to the creation of United Way's Community Advisory Councils for the Black, Chinese, and South Asian communities to identify challenges and finding solutions. Today, Sister Sharon Douglas will be sharing her thoughts on systemic racism in Canadian society. Sister Sharon.
I'm both humbled and pleased to be part of this conference. Oh, hold on. You are unmuted. Oh, okay, good. Can everybody hear me? Yes, we're good?
Yes,
okay.
we can hear you.
Yeah, okay, great. So thank you very much. I begin in the name of Allah, most merciful, the most compassionate. I am pleased to be invited to be part of this conversation that has actually taken on global proportions at this time. I think it has actually become a phenomenon, more so now because I cannot recall a time since the civil rights movement that issues of race, discrimination, and exclusion have been at the forefront of all discussions as we're witnessing it today. So I've been asked to speak a bit about systemic racism in Canada. It's a really big, broad, deep, and in many cases, a painful subject area. And I'm going to try and just narrow it in and do it in about 15 minutes or so. I want to say, acknowledge Sister Rabia's comments because there were so many pieces of it I wanted to jump and respond to. So maybe if I have some moments at the end, I will get to that. But thank you for sharing those comments, Rabia. The definition of systemic or institutional racism refers to policies and practices that are entrenched in established institutions, such as education, police, the RCMP, government, children's aid societies. So I begin this speech with the assumption, or this conversation with the assumption, that we have all now reached the conclusion that systemic racism and discrimination exists, and that we have accepted this and we've reconciled that fact within us, that it is very real and it's very present across our whole country. We also need to acknowledge that there's a long history of its existence in Canada. Now, the next question we often get logically is, so what do we do about it? How do we move forward together to dismantle and continue to disrupt the status quo. I think, however, we need to pause before we move forward. I think we need to be able to have an honest and open and hard conversation. And Sister Rabia spoke about that. We need to talk about the injustices experienced and what people have lived with today. We must talk about the impact of colonization. We must talk about the impact of the deliberate exclusion of specific populations and primarily our racialized populations. We must talk about racism, shadeism, classism amongst ourselves as racialized communities and how we interact amongst one another. We must talk about the atrocities experienced by Indigenous communities. We must talk about Islamophobia. We must talk about internalized racism. And we must talk about white supremacy, what that means, what it looks like today in our in our Canadian communities before we're able to move on. So I'm going to take us back a little bit because we're talking about systemic racism in Canada. So let's begin the conversation with the plight of our Indigenous sisters and brothers from the time their lands were stolen and taken, land that we currently inhabit. And some people have the arrogance to tell others they cannot come here, forgetting that they themselves were immigrants and somebody allowed them in here and they're not the rightful owners. The removal of Indigenous children to residential schools, the reservations that we try to pretend do not exist in Canada, yet we condemn such blatant injustices in other countries. I'm from Sydney, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, actually. Well, Cape Breton's in Nova Scotia. And in Nova Scotia, there's the Mi'kmaq community, an Indigenous community, and they live on the reservation called Memberchew. And I remember when we were in high school that the Indigenous kids, the Mi'kmaq kids would be bussed into the schools and didn't know and understand, actually never thought of it. We were in high school now. And so as we became friends in grade 10 and 11 and 12, I one day had the opportunity to go with one of my friends up to her home. And so we took the bus. I went with her to the bus up to the reservation. And for the first time in my life, came face to face with a kind of a poverty and an exclusion that I actually at the time had no language for and didn't understand, but could not reconcile the fact that how could somebody like 10 minutes from our home, which was on the other side of the bridge, have no lights, have no clean running water, need to be marginalized. And so for the very first time came face to face was what we would now call a systemic oppression of a group of people. It then made me later on begin to think about why is it the whole Black community lives on the other side in an area called the Pear? These are all the beginnings or existence and evidence of systemic discrimination as we marginalize communities. And so it was a beginning, but it was an awakening. Let's speak about the narrative that portrays Canada as a country as open and welcoming to the fugitive slaves escaping from the southern states in the mid-1800s. The story of Canada's role in the Underground Railroad is told by white historians as one of compassion and openness. This, however, was not the case most of the time. The hope of freedom and dignity that motivated many to risk their lives on the Underground Railroad with the most courageous Harriet Tubman was short-lived upon arrival. There were no longer physical chains, but it was really not the promised land. It was not the land of opportunity as had hoped, and chains became forms of servitude and exclusion. And those were the experiences of the slaves as they arrived. So the struggle to survive and thrive began in a system not built to protect Blacks, Indigenous, and other non-white communities. Actually, history says white Canadians tolerated Black freedom seekers just as a way to punish their American slave property owners. And so for them, this was their motivation for doing it. I believe this is the foundation of the myth that slavery, racism, and discrimination does not exist in Canada because Canada accepted the slaves. Again, the story told by the oppressor is very different when told by the oppressed. Nelson Mandela said, The oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed, hence the need for honest and hard conversations. Let's speak about Africville, a predominantly Black community in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It existed from the early 1800s right up to the 1960s. A community of thriving businesses, schools, well, one school, a church, community supports, and their own community supports and culture. Actually, kids were not allowed to go to the white schools, so therefore they had to have their own schools. This community was demolished and relocated. It represents today the oppression faced by Black Canadians. Actually, I'll tell you another life story. And I use stories because they're real and these are real stories. My mom, who was a nurse in Nova Scotia, my mom was also born in Sydney, Nova Scotia. We're third generation Canadians. When she graduated from high school and wanted to enter into nursing school, she was not allowed to enter into the first year because she would have to live in residence, and they would not allow Black students and white students to share space together. So she had to miss her first year and wait till there was another Black student who graduated who was interested in nursing so they could house them together. My mom became the first Black student to graduate from the Nova Scotia School of Nursing in 1950 somewhere. I can't remember the date right now, but around that time. But these are real stories. This is very much a part of our Canadian history. The history of the Maroons from Jamaica, who were actually slaves shipped here from Sierra Leone. Jamaica got fed up with all the rebellions because these slaves are fighting back so much and wanted to send them back, but nobody would take them. So the British and the French government got together and said, send them to Canada. It's freezing over there. Maybe they'll die on the way. But oh my dear Allah, they survived. Many survived and have created established communities in parts of Nova Scotia. I think recently we all know the story of Viola Desmond in Nova Scotia. Long before Rosa Parks refused to get up off the bus or give up her seat, there was the story of Viola Desmond. But because we tell the narrative of racism happening in the States, we know their history more than we know our own history. There is the story of the hanging of Angelique in Montreal, the story of a slave woman, Marie Joseph Angelique, authored by Dr. Afua Cooper. Read that book. This is the story of what experiences people lived with in Montreal. Let's also speak about the Canadian internment of the Japanese beginning in 1942. The Canadian government detained and dispossessed more than 90% of the Japanese Canadians in British Columbia. A historical fact, the first recorded race riot in North America was in Shelburne, Nova Scotia in 1784. 1784, a race riot in Canada. White soldiers returning home from war, they could not find employment, or there was not a lot of opportunities. So they took up arms and they got mad at all of the African population that was there. And they started to just terrorize these people. And these people fled that area in Shelburne and moved to Birchtown, Nova Scotia. And I believe that's how the Black community in Birchtown, Nova Scotia began. My sisters, it was only in 1916 that women in Canada were allowed to vote in Manitoba provincial elections. Ontario granted women the right to vote in 1917. But by 1918, all Caucasian women had the right to vote in federal elections. In 1918, you weren't allowed to vote in neither the provincial or federal elections. It would take another 10 years before we as women were declared persons in 1929, when women were included in the legal definition of persons. This was handed down by Canada's highest court of appeal. All of these examples, and there are many more, are used to demonstrate that systemic racism has existed in Canada since as early as the 1700s and possibly earlier. So when we talk about the need to just move on and not rehash, and this was long ago, it is not that easy. What people are living with is trauma and generational trauma that are built in and entrenched in institutions that have been structured and created to keep people within positions and oppressed positions, and not create space for people to navigate and move about freely. People, in order to move forward, the Black community, the Indigenous community, we see what's going on right now with the murdered and missing Indigenous women. Where the truths and reconciliation. It's not so easy. People need to be heard. People need to be validated. People need to be acknowledged before moving on. We need to create safe spaces for healing so that people can move on and begin that open and honest conversation. Sister Rabia spoke about the need for us to be able to talk openly and honestly about what we do. And she's absolutely right in that we all have biases and we all have different kinds of, and live with or experience or discriminate in our own ways. But if we do not begin in the privacy of our homes to at least change and flip that narrative, this issue of perpetuating racism and discrimination as it now exists will continue. We, Quran says, Jannah lies at the foot of the mother, right? And that we can either make a pauper or build a king or create a king. I'm paraphrasing now. And so we have the ability to turn that story around. How we raise our boys, how we raise our girls, how we teach them what we teach them. As Rabia said, the narrative that the slave owners created that Black is no good. That's their version of what Black was. Black came from a history, a long history. And so we need to change that conversation in our heads. Racism, as we know it, is a collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity and are substantiated by racial and racist ideas. We talk about anti-Black racism right now. We talk about white supremacy. We talk about racial profiling. We speak about Islamophobia. We speak about stereotypes and perceptions. All of these things, how we've lived our lives, influence the pathologies we have of racialized communities. And it's time for us to break that. We need to talk and look at the intersections of Islamophobia and racism and sexism. We need to look at anti-Black racism and those conversations that we have. We need to consider immigration laws and the impact they have on who gets let in and who doesn't get let in and where they're able to move. We need to talk about where our kids are going to school and where they're not going to school. We need to understand policing and the history of policing across this country. When policing started in the States and in Canada, policing didn't start to protect us. Policing started to protect the white landowners and their properties. So if you were racialized, and I don't know how many of you were here, but when, and they now say Brahma, when South Asian communities first started to come into Toronto, and I had just moved to Toronto, they were pushing people in subways. They were saying, who are these people pushing? Can you imagine pushing people into subways, trying to rip scarves off of women who were wearing scarves? And so when we have these things, to now experience those things and then come back and then replicate or do it yourselves or ourselves to one another, it's all an issue. It's all a huge conversation that needs to be done, and for us to be able to think of it. Hold on, I lost my page. I'm going to turn my page back over and I'm almost finished. Robin Maynard said, to be Black in Canada is to live slavery's afterlife. We need to look at the education system and how we as Muslims are moving within our school system, how all of our racialized and Indigenous kids move. We need to look at children's aid societies and all the issues that are faced. Our correction systems, where disproportionately we have Muslims, we have Indigenous, we have Blacks, all within the correction systems, our mental health systems. The moving on process, the let's just get over it process, requires courage, commitment, and real conversation, so we can really begin to deconstruct what race and class and gender oppression and intersectionality actually means. Nelson Mandela said, "It is always the oppressor, not the oppressed, who dictates the form of the struggle. If the oppressor uses violence, then the oppressed have no alternative but to respond violently." And we saw that as we saw what was going on with the George Floyd movement. And people were saying, but why do they need to use force and demonstrates in the streets? And so there was a point, a boiling over point, where as oppressed communities and the response to allies and accomplices have grown. And so as we begin this work, social movements and the need to change this are not based on single identity politics, like the feminist movement, the Black Power movement, the disability rights movement. They have historically conflated or ignored intergroup differences. And sometimes this has created tensions between movements. What we need to do is look at the intersectionalities and open our hearts and open our doors. And as Rabia said, understand that this is a violation of our faith. Diversity was not a mistake by Allah. It was part of the design. It was not an accident. And that we as Muslims and as women who have some degree of power and influences in our home need to, the onus lies on us to change that conversation and make them real and honest. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Walaikum assalam, and thank you very much, Sister Sharon, for this insightful talk. The experiences you shared are eye-opening. We do need to keep the dialogue going and keep learning from each other. Our next speaker, Sister Humaira Jalil, is the Chief Operating Officer at the Canadian Muslim Women's Institute. It is a community organization that was funded in 2006. CMWI works for the empowerment of women by providing support to women and their families. Sister Humaira is a graduate of the Ad-Duha Institute of Islamic Sciences and has been a member of ICNA Sisters Canada for the last 8 years. She also serves as the co-director of Amnesty International Winnipeg Group and has been vocal about human rights issues affecting immigrants and minorities. Today, Sister Humaira would enlighten us on Islam's anti-racist message, Islamic perspective of equality and justice.
Sister Bushra, I'm trying to share my screen. If you can allow me to share my screen, please. So, Assalamu alaikum, dear sisters. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. I want to thank Sister Sharon and Sister Rabia for their talk and focusing on the different, racism and in Canada, because Canada has its own problems, right? Canada has its own problems, and these are so, they're especially with the indigenous communities, we see it everywhere. This is present. This is not something of the past, but it seems like, we are not able to do what is needed. But, we are here today, and I commend all of you. Alhamdulillah, those who are here, then this topic is important to you, and that's what I believe, that we are here and we should be discussing this and, taking some pointers for ourselves. So thank you for the organizers, and thank you to the sisters who have, I'm sure, worked hard to bring this webinar to us on a very important topic. And not just an important topic because it's a hot topic right now. But you know what? This is an action item for all of us, for all those who consider ourselves as believers, alhamdulillah. We continually need to be involved and learn, become more aware of what is going on around us, and get involved. That's the thing, that my main focus is that, yes, becoming aware of the situation is just not enough, right? I mean, the horrible, tragic incident that took the life of George Floyd and so many more before him and others, that will come after him, unfortunately, who have suffered at the hands of this pandemic called racism, right? Suddenly it made us realize that, you know what, we need to learn so much. We need to get involved. We need to spend time building trust with the communities that are affected by this. We need to become allies. If we don't see ourselves as the ones being affected as much as the communities that are suffering, like our, indigenous brothers and sisters, our Black brothers and sisters, and other minorities, then at least I think we need to be becoming their allies, learn from them, instead of, Sister Rabia, talked a little bit about how we have so much inherent racism in our communities. We are not immune to it. And that comes out when we find spouses for our children. So, you know what? Instead of dropping judgments, we need to spend time to learn. We need time to, it's time to be informed, be inspired by what's going on around us, be aware of the different perspectives, the history, the contexts, because as most of us are immigrants, we are not very, and I speak for myself, we are not aware of the history of what happened to the indigenous communities at the hands of the colonial powers. So it is, for us, the first thing is to understand the history, the context, right? So inshallah, we see there, Islam has given us guidance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us guidance on everything that we need in this world. So we see that Islam teaches us why there is racism. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, not racism, but the creation of different races. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says when he's explaining in the Quran about the creation of Adam, and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his hadith tells us that when Allah created Adam alayhi salam, the first human being, he created him from a handful of clay, which he took from the whole of the earth. So the children of Adam are in accordance with the earth. Some are red, some are white, some are black, some a mixture, also smooth and rough, bad and good. And this is a Sahih hadith. The Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created human beings from different colored clay. And that doesn't mean anybody is superior to anyone else, any race or any shade is superior. So the superiority due to physical characteristics is actually not an Islamic concept at all. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us from his, we say that from this, we are all his creation. We are, he did not just create one shade. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in variety, everything in variety, not just one. He created mankind also in different shades. And according to the ideology of Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam also teach us that the outward is not important. One of the hadiths that we have from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that Allah does not look at your outward appearance and your wealth. He looks only at your hearts and your deeds. And this is a Sahih hadith as well. Why is the outward not important? Why? Because we don't have a choice over it. Nobody asked us what color do you want to be born or what features you want. We don't have control over it. What we have control over is what is inside, and that is also represented by our deeds. So what is inside comes out as our deeds. And that is what we have to be accountable for. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will look at our deeds. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created different colored races, and the need for the different races is explained in Surah Hujurat. Surah Hujurat is ayah number 13, says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Ya ayyuhan nasu inna khalaqnakum min zakarin wa unsa wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qabaila lita'arafu. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. Inna allaha alimun khabir. We created you from a single pair of male and female and made you into nations and tribes, that you may know each other, not that you may despise each other. Verily, the most honored of you in the sight of Allah is he who is the most righteous of you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking to all mankind, Ya ayyuhan nas, and saying that we created you from a single male and female, and created you in different nations and tribes so that you may know each other. That's the reason. It's not so that one can consider themselves superior to the others. And creation of different nations and tribes and races is an ayah of Allah. It's a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you read the Quran, you will see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that, we are invited by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to ponder over his signs, to ponder over his ayat. And so we are told, ponder and think about these different signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we look at this, at this ayah, we learn that yes, this is a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is an ayah of Allah, that Allah created so many different nations and different features and people of different colors, from black to white and everyone in between. Why? So it makes us ponder, and this is a part of a believer's requirement of a believer, that you need to ponder over ayahs of Allah, of the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know that when the Quran was revealed, it was revealed in a pre-Islamic era, in the era of Jahiliyyah, ignorance. And the concept of superiority of race was destroyed by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because in that society, in the Jahiliyyah Arab society at that time, the tribes were, one tribe considered superior to the other tribe. And so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in his last sermon, made it very clear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created all mankind from Adam and Eve, Adam and Hawa alayhi salam. And Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, or a non-Arab has no superiority over any Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, or a black has any superiority over white, except by piety and good action. Again, we go back to that Allah is not going to look at the skin color. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to look at the outward, because that's what he created. That's what we were born with. Like Sister Rabia was saying, that we are born as a woman. That's our, we didn't have any control over, but that's a test. And that's how, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given different tests to everyone. And what he will check us or take account of us is on our deeds, right? So this was a very foreign concept is a very, very foreign concept to Islam, that any race has superiority over any other race. So when we know about different, the racism and different, clashes of different, let's say, races, one considering themselves better than other, and then, you have all different kinds of, racism that different communities are facing, then what is our role there? Again, I come to the point that we don't have to just be aware of it. We have to do something about it. We have to take action. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his Quran, in Surah Nisa, ayah number 135 says that, O you who have believed, be persistently standing firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves or parents and relatives. Whether one is rich or poor, Allah is more worthy of both. So follow not personal inclination, lest you not be just. And if you distort your testimony, and this is about verbal testimony, or refuse to give it, then indeed Allah is ever with what you do. He is acquainted. So we are told, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu kunu qawwamina bil qist. Be standing firm for justice. And this tells us that we are not people who just talk about things. Injustice is very widespread on this earth. There can be no peace if justice is not established. And establishing justice is the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding us explicitly that you have to, oh you who believe, if you believe, then you have to do this. You have to stand up for justice. Before Islam, like I mentioned, the people were living in a state of ignorance, and their loyalties used to be with themselves, their families, and their tribes. Even if their own committed an injustice, they would side with their own tribe, their own people, their own family. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent this verse down, commanding Muslims to be just even if it went against themselves or their parents, their relatives, or those who had wealth. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he commanded us to stand up for justice, he did not leave us to just ponder and think and philosophize about it, but he actually made us and asked us to take action. My dear sisters, you must all be aware of this hadith, and I think we tell this to our children and everybody, and I just want to remind myself first and us all about this hadith that was narrated by Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anhu. He says that I heard the Messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say, whoever of you sees an evil must then change it with his hand. If he is not able to do so, then he must change it with his tongue. And if he is not able to do so, then he must change it with his heart or within his heart. And that is the slightest or the least of the faith. And this is narrated by Muslim. So standing up for justice, we need to learn, first of all, I think we lack, some of us, at least I know I, as an immigrant woman, I'm not so aware of the history, the context, and Sister Sharon shared a little bit with us, but you know, when we are here and we know that to fight this fight, you have to be aware. So we need to be educated not only in our mind, but in our hearts as well, because the emotional part of this has to be there. The emotional part of this learning should be there, or else we cannot really understand. We cannot understand the issue and the fight for this, and we cannot continue the fight against racism, either that racism, if it's against our Black brothers and sisters, other minorities, or even indigenous, as in the case of Canada. We live here. This is our struggle. We need to, we need to be the ones who have their name listed in the list of those who stood up for justice, right? So inshallah, I will leave you with the final thought. What action are you going to take, or what action are you taking currently? Because our sisters are involved in so many ways, but what more can you do? That's my question to you and to myself. Am I the one who just says, okay, I'll do a little bit and that's enough for me, or am I doing more? This is the fight of the time. This is the injustice of the time that we are seeing. And this is not in far off places. This is happening here in our cities. So what are you doing? Are you learning? Are we becoming allies with those who are fighting this fight? Are we standing up for justice as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has asked us to do, has commanded us to do? So inshallah, I will stop here. So I hope and pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give us the opportunity and give us blessings in our efforts for whatever we do regarding this fight, and that we will become more involved, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sister Humaira, for enlightening us with the Islamic perspective of equality and justice. My name is Bushra Fazil, and I'll be your host till the end of the program. Our next guest is Dr. Nahla Goma from Edmonton. Dr. Nahla is a physician, educator, researcher, and educator. Dr. Goma has represented the Muslim community as a speaker in interfaith settings and events around difficult times such as Quebec and New Zealand mosque shootings. She has been actively involved in events and projects aimed at empowering youth and women. She is currently serving as a board member and the educational committee chair of South Muslim Community Center in Edmonton, Alberta. She has been a member of the Provincial Alberta Anti-Racism Advisory Council for almost 2 years, and also Alberta chapter lead of the Islamic History Month of Canada. Dr. Nahla will discuss with us racism in Muslim Ummah, Muslim community. Dr. Nahla.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks for the honorable invitation. I'm trying to share my screen here, but I'm disabled actually. So if I can ask the host to share the screen or allow me to share the screen, be greatly appreciated. I can still share the screen. Oh, okay. I think we're getting there. Let me, yeah. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So thank you, dear sisters, for this honorable invitation to talk about justice for humanity. I will pick up from where Sister Humaira left, and she actually, I was asked to talk about the discrimination and racism in the Muslim Ummah, which it's a tough subject to talk about. So I had to do a lot of research in that perspective, but I'll pick up from where Sister Humaira left, from the farewell address or the last sermon of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Again, I won't repeat it again, but it says all humans are descended from Adam and Eve. There is no superiority of Arab over non-Arab, and neither there of non-Arab over Arab, white over black, or black over white, except for piety on the basis of personal piety and righteousness. So when we go back to the history, and I'm trying to go back to the history to reflect on what we are having nowadays of racism and discrimination. If we go back to the Islamic history, and I always say Islam is perfect, we are not as Muslims. We find some figures of Muslims in the history that was actually black or questioned to be black, or there was no comment on their color just because the color was not important in the Muslim history. Who can forget Bilal radiallahu anh, the first one who raised the adhan at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Bilal came to Mecca as a slave, a black slave, very clearly a slave. He was of the first of those who converted into Islam, adopted Islam, and never shifted from it, even though he was tortured in every aspect. And then he was a figure, he became a figure in the Muslim history of being the first one who raised the adhan. His voice was fantastic, as narrated by many of the Sahaba or the companions of the Prophet radiallahu anhum. Who can forget about Najashi? Najashi was the king of Abbasis, or Ethiopia now, and he gave the protection to the Muslims in the first immigration, first hijrah, even before the second hijrah to Medina or to Yathrib. In fact, some scholars would go for Adam alayhi salam that he was actually a person of color. Adam was not white and was not blonde. He was a person of color, and mostly he was kind of dark. He had a dark complexion. Prophet Ibrahim as well as Prophet Musa Moses is known to be, he was described as the color of people from the tribe of Zut, and those tribes were known to be actually to the darker side of the skin. In fact, they were kind of black. Prophet Jesus, there is no literature that actually describe his color, except from the Christian side of literature. But on the Muslim side, there is a hadith. Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the Prophet Muhammad didn't see Jesus alayhi salam face to face, but he had a dream that he saw a dark man that looked like Jesus alayhi salam. And so there is no, at this time, that the companions didn't actually care about the color of Jesus alayhi salam or description of his face, because again, the most important for them was the prophet as a prophet, like his actions. Dhul Qarnayn, who is known in the Surah Al-Kahf as a long story of Dhul Qarnayn, again, the scholars would be differing in the color of the skin, and in fact, Dhul Qarnayn, there is differences in the entity of Dhul Qarnayn himself. So, but these are some examples in our like old history of people who are figures. In the new history, there is other figures of people who are having the darker complexion, and they are still fighting for Islam and standing for Islam, and we wouldn't be able to be just for them or fair for them if we count some of them. So if we go back to, again, when I say the minorities in the Muslim community. So in this, I could, when I searched the literature, I could find some of the literature that are from the Ottoman Empire. Even though the Ottoman Empire, there is lots of pros and cons with it, but I'm not talking about the empire as an empire, but I'm talking about the models of treating minorities in different empires. That's how I can refer to. So in the Ottoman Empire, people of the book were referred to as Ahlul Dhimma, and the Dhimmi meant protected, meant in Arabic, in actual Arabic, protected on behalf of God and Prophet, and his Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which meant that the Muslims had an immense responsibility towards people of the minorities, that were the people of the minorities at this point in the Muslim empire were Ahlul Zimma, were the Jews and Christians. So the duties of the Muslims towards them was that the Muslim state is responsible for two things: justice and security towards the Ahlul Kitab or the Dhimmiyin, Ahlul Dhimma. Now, from the literature, again, we can find some of the documents that would determine the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims. The two of them that stand out between the literature were the Charter of Medina that the Prophet ﷺ signed when he went to the Medina as immigrant at the first time with the Jews of Medina. They were the minorities at this time, because the Muslim state was established in Medina. So this charter actually allowed the Jews to continue living in the Medina and working on their trades. The responsibility again of the Muslims were to protect the whole Medina, including the minorities there. And they asked the Jews just to help in protection, just in case the Muslims cannot provide the protection aspect, because of the low number at this time. They didn't have the number or the manpower to fulfill the full protection. Equivalent to this was the Pact of Umar radiallahu anhu, Umar ibn al-Khattab, when he got Syria. So in Syria, there was the Jews and Christians. He gave them the full autonomy. Again, he suggested that, or not suggested, but that was part of the pact, that they would protect the minorities, but they may ask for their protection to the whole state. And again, it's out of the concept that the state would act as a one state. In these cases, the minorities were paying jizya, which is very equivalent now to taxes. The jizya at that time was less than the zakah that the Muslims would pay. So if we think that the zakah is 2.5%, it was much less than this. So definitely much less than any taxes that we know of at this time. And so when we see religious minorities in the time of Ottoman Empire, and again, I'm talking about models, there were two models that treated the minorities in the history. One is called the group right model, and one is the individual rights model. So the individual rights model is what the Western civilization has gone through, which is liberalism. The group rights model, though, treated groups as groups. So it's a sovereignty for each group to practice their religion. It's self-governing to each group, whatever the group is, whether they are Christians, Muslims of different sects, or even non-Muslims at all. They are granted collective rights under the Ottoman Empire. So that was the model that was followed by the Ottoman Empire. And so they treated the group as a group, and there was differential treatment for each group, depends on their needs. Whereas the liberalism, they completely ignored the group needs. So it's the individuals are equivalent in front of law and in front of the state, which is fine. But in ignoring the group needs was kind of had its pros and cons in the history. So the religion in their in the individual rights model was kind of not being valued, or not a factor that's being considered. And so the needs of individual groups based on religion, or based on their being minorities, or based on colors, was not to be taken into consideration, because everyone is equal in front of law. Again, there is no good and bad, but they are two different models. And so in the individual rights model, everyone accepts the values and differences, but in the groups right model, there was differential treatment for differential groups. So how did they deal with the groups? It's very difficult to deal with minorities, and the minorities under the Ottoman Empire were many. Not only includes the Ahlul Dhimma, or the people of the book, but they were the Baha'i, and they were the other sects under the Ottoman Empire. So each covenant was represented by what's called the millet, or creed, or religion. That was equivalent to creed or religion. And so they were called Muslim millet, Jewish millet, and Christian millet, or other religions millet. So every millet has, again, the autonomy to run their own affairs. The state do not interfere with the affairs of the millet or the group. Now, different subgroups were represented as different millets. Each millet had a head, or a representative, who would be responsible, has responsibilities towards his group, but in the meantime represent his group on behalf of the judge of the Ottoman Empire. So he was responsible, this head of the millet would be responsible for resolving conflicts within the group, for enabling the group to practice religion, for avoiding conflicts with other groups, for finding financial aids in case there is needy persons in the group, and to represent the religious, in religious coexistence, so in front of other groups. Now, after some time, it looks like this model was not very appealing for the general, the way that the world was going, the Western civilization, and with the Western coming to, again, occupation of taking some of the Ottoman Empire. So there was a need, it looks like in the history, for the Ottoman Empire to change, to make a change or reforms in order to cope with the Western civilization. So all these subgroups turn it into what's called tanzimat. And tanzimat means, again, reforms. But the tanzimat were basically based on models of, again, of daily life, of kind of liberalism in a way. So it turned it from millet, or from subgroups of religions or minorities as such, to sort of industries, trades. So it would be factories, mining, agricultural, things like this, which has to do with again, stabilization of the daily life, but it started to ignore and wipe out the definition of minorities as such. Now, with the Tanzimat, there was new legal codes that were adopted from the French code, basically, and we all know from North Africa that we had the French code as a model of part of our laws. There was secular courts, or Nizami, they called it Nizami, were established. The Ministry of Justice was created. So there has been some changes, but as I said, the changes were made on equal rights were represented, but there was a wiping out of the differential needs of minorities at that time. Now, what I could see, and this is my extrapolation from how I dealt with different communities and unprivileged community or non-privileged communities, is that there are some factors that led to discrimination in the Muslim community. And those factors, I could divide them into intersocial factors and intrasocial factors, societal factors. Sorry. So the intersocietal factors were depending on, those were easy. Those were coming from colonial practices of social stratification. For example, an example for this would be, again, North Africa and Algeria and Tunisia, as we will see when the Arabic language is completely wiped out. And the concept was, if you are high caliber, you would speak French. But if you are of the lay people, then you would speak the Arabic. And so this generation after generation, they started to build this concept that in order to be of high caliber and educated and so on and so forth, you would speak the Western language and not your own language. That was part of the concept that started to settle even in the population of these areas, even in the Muslim population of these areas. The concept of reverse psychology. So the younger generation grew up with the concept that if I were belonging to a Western family, I would have been treated better. It's the fact that I was born to a Muslim family or a family of color. This is the reason for which I'm being discriminated. And so this reverse psychology for different generations have created a lot of clashes between the generations. They have created generations which can't stand for themselves or can't value their differences as valuable differences. The intra-societal factors that originated from within the community and originated or the society and originated as a response to this were even much worse. So that were, again, based on the reverse psychology, that's how people would think. Because I'm born in a non-privileged society, that's what I take. This is the consequence. The cultural effect and mixing historical effects. So the next generations didn't know what's their history, what they would value about their history, especially when you lose the language or the mother tongue language. You lose a lot. You lose the history. The language barriers started to be a problem. Loss of confidence in the same race. The effect of Western occupation, and that affected the majority of North Africa, as we will see later. Again, I could collect from the literature of Canada a few journalists and authors who spoke clearly about and could compare the models of minorities in the Muslim world and minorities in Canada. So one of them is Huda Azmoidet. Huda is a Tunisian journalist who worked in Libya. She's the co-founder of Black Tunisian Women Organization, Al Anbar. That's her quotation. I often see myself as oxymoron, Black and Tunisian, two irreconcilable identities that often made me the subject of heavy scrutiny, curiosity. For many people, it's including Tunisia itself. So even in her own country, she, as a woman of color, it was difficult to survive in her own country, which is a Muslim country, and she's a Muslim. I came to embrace and reclaim my racial identity as part of me after the revolution in late 2010, early 2011, where I took part in social movements, and the Black Tunisian came forward to represent the dark colored skin. So the story goes on and on that Huda herself worked in a struggle in Libya, and it looks like again, and I'm trying to collect from the literature that in January 23, Tunisia was actually commemorating the day that they abolished slavery in 1846, to become the pioneer in the Arab and Islamic world in doing so in this barbaric practice. The trans-Saharan slave trade, as well as the Barbary corsair raids in European countries, brought about 100,000 Black, African, and white European slaves to the Ottoman-ruled Tunisian kingdom in the 19th century. So again, this area, this part of the history looks like there was a chaotic mixture between the models, between the concepts of the Ottoman empires trying to adopt something that's outside the model of that they started with, and the actual Islamic model. And she refers to Ahmed Bey as the Tunisian ruler who actually led this movement. Being a Black Tunisian journalist in Libya helped her to form an understanding of the complexities of relationships. So even people who were of Black complexion living in Libya, that was hard for them to survive, as there was a lot of hostility towards immigrants coming from the Sahara Desert. And Huda moved to live in Quebec, and so she could relate or refer her experience in Quebec and with what's happening with the Muslim Quebecois to what was happening in Tunisia and in Libya. And when she's talking about hijab, the banning of hijab in Quebec, she's actually referring to her, comparing to her story back in Libya, and it's very. This is one of the authors that I would encourage you to read for her. Very hard-taking story when you read the comparison and you read how people, even in the new history, are suffering because she's a woman, because she's Muslim, because she's a woman of color as well. Now, when we talk about Black Muslims in Canada, they made up about 9% of the total national Muslims population. The total national Muslim population made up about 3.2% of the total Canadian population, according to 2011 National Household Study by Statistics Canada, and it might have grown by now. I apologize if this is an old figure, but most of the researches that we can find is about the Somali community when we talk about Black Canadians.
We are just running out of time, so.
Sure. So we can find, so this is a systematic review that was done on behalf of the Somali community, and with some themes that came out of it. The Somali constitutes about 50% of the Black Muslim immigrants, that there were some themes like aging in the Somali community, schooling in the Somali community, policing, and other themes. But they were still lacking talking about other minorities when it came to skin color and racism. So what I can see is there is different layers of being discriminated in Canada or outside Canada. It's the human intricacy, which is the difference that we have and the non-agreement that we have between each other, depending on our teaching and our education and our background and our history. And then comes the color, ethnicity, and then another layer of being a woman, and then a fourth layer of being a Muslim or the religion in general, and then practicing. I've heard different stories from even sects of or different subcategorization of Christians who were actually discriminated when they came to Canada at the beginning. So that tells us that racism is not an exception anywhere. This is the cultural iceberg, they call it, and they say that there is core values that determine our discrimination. Or feeling of discrimination, or the basis of our discrimination, which are coming from the history, again, from our culture, from our background, and then the attitude that we present, and then on top of this comes the behavior, which basically is being modified by the needs of daily life. Now, Queensland's University of Technology have made some strategies to enhance the ability of living culturally safe, basically. One of them is reflecting on our own culture and attitude, the clear, value-free, open, respectful communication. So being open to communication, developing trust between each other, and recognizing and avoiding the stereotypical barriers. And being prepared to engage in a healthy dialogue, and understanding the influence of cultural shock. So when I'll end by talking about the Muslim, again, the discrimination against Muslim women. This is very evident even in the Muslim countries. When the last concept that I was asked to talk about was actually the converse and why it's in the Muslim culture, and that in itself needs another discussion. So I definitely love to hear, to listen to people who are converts like Yusuf Estes or Joshua or other converts. But there is also, when we talk about these cultural differences, there has been incidents where there is a clash of cultures and learning curve that comes with being a newcomer to Islam. That was presented in the Muslim women's side as nobody is representing them. Nobody is representing them as being Muslim, wearing hijab and adopting hijab. And on the other side, yes, people would love to represent themselves as newcomers to Islam, but that again was it needs a common understanding, if I should say, and being open to dialogue of how long does it take to learn the concept of Islam, the basic concept of Islam, in order to be able to talk about it. I hope I had some elaboration on the different aspects I was asked to talk about, and I'll be open to question session. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاكم الله خيرا.
Thank you, Dr. Nahla, for shedding light on this topic. It is time for us to change our attitudes towards our brothers and sisters in Islam and minorities as well. As mentioned in Quran, chapter 3, Surah Al Imran, verse 110, you are now the best people brought forth for the guidance and reform of mankind. You enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong and believe in Allah. Having said that, last but not least, our last speaker of tonight's program is Sister Shelby Daigle. She is Muslim Link's editor-in-chief. She is an anti-racism advocate and has authored a report on addressing anti-Black racism in Ottawa in 2016, published by the Ottawa Local Immigrant Partnership and the City for All Women Initiative. I would like to call Sister Shelby.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Sister Shelby. Where do I begin? I have 15 minutes and I'm going to take it. It's interesting that Sister Nala was mentioning about Black Tunisian researcher Huda, because she's a friend of mine, and Muslim Link actually hosted her in February. And she would be a great person to invite, but I think her understanding of the history of anti-Black racism in the Muslim community would probably be very different. I'm going to try to give people a very concrete action plan. And I would say, number one, Muslims, particularly the Muslims who are speakers here, you need to stop comparing Islamic ideals and non-Muslim realities. Instead, what you need to be doing is comparing reality with reality. Again, Sharon Douglas said something interesting, that oftentimes the version we're hearing about Canadian history is the version of the victors. We have to understand the version we're often hearing about Muslim history is the version of the victors. It's not actually what happened. There's a lot of academic research done by people from Muslim backgrounds into the history of anti-Black racism and enslavement over the last 1,400 years in Muslim majority countries. And it's incredibly disturbing and ugly, but it's reality. So it's very important to understand that. Why is it very important to understand that? Because unfortunately, living in a city like Ottawa, Black people who are not even Muslim are now very familiar with the term abid. And the fact that for some reason in Arabic, the term abid, which means slave, is equivalent with Black. That's not something that's the creation of Europeans. That's something that has to do with a long-standing history in Arabic-speaking communities. They're actually, interestingly enough, in Michigan, there was a campaign called the Stop the A-Word campaign. It even made mainstream media because it was basically saying Arabic speakers stop referring to every Black person you see as an abid. It's racist. The N-word's terrible, but the N-word means Black. Abid means slave. How did that become equivalent in people's minds? That's very deep-seated, and we have to understand it's something that's very deep-seated, very long-standing, has a longer history than the history of anti-Black racism amongst Western people. So it cannot be blamed on them. And so again, I do encourage people to give sisters like Huda a platform, you know, and where she'll share her personal journey, even going as far as talking about how when she went to school, she was taught Arabic poetry from the Middle Ages that talked about how Black people needed to be whipped because they were slaves. Even if they were free, they needed to be whipped. And that's poetry, Arabic classical poetry by scholars from the Middle Ages. And that same quote was actually put on one of the walls in one of the abandoned villages of a traditional Black community in Libya that she did reporting on. So that idea and that mindset is deep-seated, that it's coming from poetry from the Middle Ages. We need to talk about realities. We need to have the confidence to do that. There's something called white fragility, and it's often the discomfort white people have in having honest conversations about racism. I would say there's a very serious discomfort amongst Middle Eastern, North African, South Asian Muslims in having honest conversations about histories of racism and discrimination against minorities. That's not based on ideals. We need to stop it. Again, if we're talking about a country like Pakistan, well, people just mentioned colorism. Well, why not mention the fact that there are people to this day who are the descendants of African peoples who were bought there as slaves. And they face socioeconomic discrimination in employment and access to education. So it's beyond colorism. This is a whole community that, much like Black people in the States, are descended from slaves who were bought by and sold by Muslims. It wasn't just the Portuguese who can be blamed. It was an international slave trade, right? That took people from the Bantu communities from Southern Africa and Eastern Africa and displaced them. So we have to talk about realities right now. And again, you can go online and find people from these communities, from these Black communities, sharing their own stories in Urdu. So number one, please talk about reality. Don't talk about the ideals of Islam. Talk about what's actually happened over the last 1,400 years. And be open to accepting the fact that at the end of the day, you need to understand more what the history happened from the people who were enslaved, from the people who were discriminated against, from the people who were the minorities, not how history was written by the victors. If we're going to take that for Canada, we have to take that for Muslim history as well. That's number one. Number two, understand that many Black people who are not Muslim know this history. They know the history of anti-Black racism in the Muslim world in countries like Pakistan or Tunisia or Egypt. Why do they know that? Because unfortunately, many Black people who've ended up in Canada have crossed through these countries, sometimes as international students, like in countries like Tunisia, sometimes as refugees in countries like Egypt. I remember having a disturbing experience one time when a refugee family from Southern Sudan moved into our neighborhood. The children were being constantly harassed by Muslim children, Arab children. They befriended white children because the white children weren't boldly racist to them, whereas the Arab children were. But the interesting thing was is that they didn't read me as a Black person. They read me as an Arab because, of course, in Egypt, there's people who are my skin color. And because I wear hijab, they were terrified of me. Every time I would walk out the door, they would run into the house. Even their mother would run in. And eventually, I had developed a rapport with their father to ask, why do they do that? And he's like, well, you have to understand we were refugees in Egypt, and, people were constantly harassing us, calling us monkeys, calling us slaves, throwing rocks at us, throwing grapes at us, all these things. And so they learned to be afraid of Muslim people because that was their experience. Again, that's not something people learned from Western colonizers. That's something that has to do with a long-standing history of how people have treated Black people in these regions. It's also important to understand another aspect of this. What were the faiths of Black people who were enslaved in a lot of these regions? Well, many Black people in Sub-Saharan Africa are indigenous people who had their own indigenous religious traditions. So unfortunately, enslaving them was justified based on the idea that they were civilizing them by making them Muslim. Now, disturbingly, and this is evidence of this in the history of Tunisia that sort of was one of the many reasons that led to the abolition of slavery of Black peoples in Tunisia, was that it ends up many Muslims were actually being enslaved in Tunisia. They would just grab any Black person from sort of West Africa, and the idea sort of being that there was this weird idea in the head that Black people couldn't possibly be Muslim. Here's a disturbing thing. This plays out to this day. If you ask Hoda, she'll talk about how she'll go to mosque in Tunisia or go to mosque in Quebec or here, and people will ask her, oh, when did you convert to Islam? My Nigerian friends, again, I'm half Nigerian. My father is Christian, but he went to an Islamic high school because it was cheaper than the Christian one. So there, Islam has a long-standing history in Nigeria. But many of my Nigerian friends, when they were part of Muslim students associations, when they go to mosque, people ask them when they converted. The idea that somehow a dark-skinned Black person or any kind of Black person could actually have a long-standing history of being Muslim is somehow just a really big surprise to many Muslim people. That's not the fault of Europeans. That has something to do with specific issues that have happened over the history of time in Muslim countries and communities, particularly in terms of how it relates to interactions with Black people. And it's important to understand that people know this. Black people know this. Black people know about marriage issues. So again, you mentioned the issue of issues of colorism. It's very difficult for Black people to marry into either Middle East or North African or South Asian communities. I mean, sometimes entire families decide to disown their children. Disturbingly, and this is, again, not just a problem with daughters marrying Black men, it's also a problem for sons marrying Black women. I have friends, female friends, who, did marry South Asian and Middle Eastern men, and oftentimes they have terrible experience with their in-laws, particularly their mothers-in-laws, who are really concerned the children are going to be dark-skinned, really concerned the kids are going to have, curly hair, really concerned that the kids are going to have certain faces, but also deep down don't believe that these women, these Black women, can possibly be good Muslim mothers, because they can't possibly really know the religion, because Black people can't possibly really know the religion. And again, that's not an idea that has anything to do with Europeans. So it's important to understand that Black people, both Black Muslim people and definitely Black people who are not Muslim, who have immigrated to a city like Ottawa, to cities like Toronto, have history with really quite negative histories, and they know these things. So they would want, so if they were listening to this conversation, they would want to hear a bit more honesty about the realities today, because that would help them develop trust. Because again, when we're talking about solidarity, we need to understand that you can't declare solidarity. You can't declare allyship. Allyship is about relationships. People have to actually believe that you are going to support them. You have to build trust. And you only start building trust when you can show that you're willing to be honest and open to recognizing your daily realities. Now, when it comes to the issue of police brutality, the sad reality is that we've had a number of Black people being killed by police just this year. 2 Black people were killed in Peel region, so that's Mississauga, Brampton, starting in January, and then there's another in April. Serious questions about both their deaths. One of them was shot in the back of the head while he was in his car. The other was shot in his home after he called the police for himself to get help. You had massive protests from Black communities in that region. You had speeches and calls for justice, but there wasn't really much attention from Canadian media, and there certainly wasn't attention from members of the Muslim community who lived in Peel region. But then now people knowing more about those cases because of the death of Ijaz Chowdhury, and understand and realizing, wait a minute, there's something going on with the Peel Regional Police. Yeah, and there had been something going on the entire year. There's also people now coming forward who were shot but didn't die, completely unarmed. It's important to understand, at the end of the day, you cannot have injustice happening with one part of the community for it not eventually spill over into your own. So the sad reality is that you have to start, we can't normalize the deaths of Black people or Indigenous people at the hands of police. It will eventually affect Muslim people. It will eventually affect South Asian and Middle Eastern and North African Muslim people, because you can't let that kind of behavior go unchecked. So for Muslims who are in Peel region listening to this, please learn about the story of DeAndre Campbell and start reaching out and supporting his family, and not simply out of the fact that Black Lives Matter and George Floyd is trending, or because of the Ijaz Chowdhury case, but because it's the right thing to do, because Ontario and Canada has a long history of killing Black people, particularly Black men, and no one doing anything about it, and no one seeing any justice. But if Muslims in places like Mississauga and Brampton actually stood up, because the reality is they are the taxpayers, they are the communities that oftentimes the police see it themselves as serving, it's important that they will honestly be more likely to listen to you, unfortunately, than they will be to listen to Black people, because as we've seen over the last year, they haven't listened to Black people. So it's important to speak up, because unfortunately, because of taxpayer financial reasons, because of who gets framed as the community to be served versus the community to be policed, they are more likely to listen to you. In terms of my own journey, I am a convert to Islam. I've been Muslim for 18 years. And all I have to say is that at the end of the day, a lot of these issues are very deep-seated in your communities. You have over 1,400 years of dealing with this. Yes, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he stood against this. He stood against it because it was part of the community. It didn't stop being part of the community after he made it very clear that Muslims shouldn't do this, and unfortunately spread and morphed and changed and morphed into other things as Muslims spread in different places. So it's really important to face this history and to start building real relationships, particularly with non-Muslim Black people. Because again, at the end of the day, the majority of Black people in Canada are not Muslim. And it's important to start showing that, not only can we show respect to a community that's from a different race, but also from a different religious background. Because unfortunately, many Black people who now live in Canada, their experiences with Muslims have been that we do not respect people who are Black, and we do not respect people who are not Muslim. So there's a lot of ways in which we have to make up for that tragedy. And in my own experience, I've been able to build bridges with people who've had very traumatic experiences in Muslim majority countries and help them have a more positive view of Islam and Muslims. And that's been incredibly healing for me and for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Shelby, for sharing how can we combat racism as Canadian citizens. Now it is our duty as a citizen to stand for justice and play an active role in this society to combat injustice. I would like to thank all our guest speakers who took out time from their busy schedules and shared their experiences and knowledge with us. ICNA Sisters Canada would like to invite sisters from all backgrounds to join us as a team who can lead by example and strive hard to eliminate social injustice from Canadian society. May Allah Almighty accept it from us all and forgive our shortcomings. Amen. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal asr, inna al-insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihati, wa tawasaw bil haqqi, wa tawasaw bis sabr. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Have a great weekend.